4 months ago, she was the emerging Democratic frontrunner. Now, depending on who you ask, Elizabeth Warren is fighting to stay in the race. After placing third in Iowa and a distant fourth in New Hampshire, the Massachusetts senator is far behind current frontrunners Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders in the delegate count. And as the race moves on to Nevada and South Carolina, she's having to scale back a bit, cutting more than $200,000 in ad buys, according to the political ad tracker Advertising Analytics. Next comes Super Tuesday, the primary day for more than a dozen states, including Massachusetts, where Warren is still ahead but slipping with 23% support, according to a poll taken just before the New Hampshire vote, down 10 points from October. Her campaign says she's making a big push in her home state, with field director Jossie Valentin telling the Boston Globe just in the last month, we made 150,000 calls to Massachusetts voters. While billionaires try to buy the election, we are continuing to build a grassroots movement. Obviously referring in so many words to billionaires like Michael Bloomberg, who just opened a campaign office in Springfield, and frontrunner Bernie Sanders, who reportedly just hired 2 full-time staffers here. So what does this all mean for the senator from Massachusetts, the senior senator? Is she vulnerable in her home state? Joining me to discuss are Joan Vennochi, a columnist for the Boston Globe, Kaivan Shroff, founder of the group Millennial Democrats and a former digital organizer for Hillary for America, and Stephanie Murray, author of the Politico Massachusetts Playbook. Thank you all for being here. Joan, let me start with you. How vulnerable do you think Warren is here in her home state?
Well, you just laid out some vulnerability in that poll number, 23%. She doesn't have to worry about Deval Patrick because he's not running, but she does have to worry about Bernie Sanders, who did really well against Hillary Clinton, who won back in 2016. She's got Bloomberg, who set up an office in Springfield on the day that the New Hampshire primary was taking place. And he's making himself known here. So, she's got to fight.
It's probably worth mentioning that polls have shown that, well, she beat Jeff Deal, not by, it wasn't whisker thin, but she didn't crush him. It wasn't 2-1 or anything like that. And her favorable, unfavorable ratings are not always overly impressive in Massachusetts.
Right. She's never been the most popular senator from Massachusetts.
Yeah. Kaivan, Elizabeth Warren, after she finished fourth on election night, gave a concession speech in which she, to my ear at least, tried to rebrand herself as someone who could bring together the disparate factions of the Democratic Party and propel the party to victory in November. Let's take a look at what she had to say.
We cannot afford to fall into factions. We can't afford to squander our collective power. We win when we come together. Our campaign is best positioned to beat Donald Trump in November because we can unite our party.
Her campaign manager, Roger Lau, sent out a huge memo, which I'm still trying to digest, trying to put numbers behind that claim. Do you buy it?
I think it's too early to write anything off right now. I think she made the point in that concession speech that there's still 98% left of the delegates up for grabs. 99.9% of black voters in the Democratic primary have yet to vote.
That's a remarkable statistic.
That said, I think that's not her strong point still. She's a third, I think, among black voters. Biden's obviously first. I think I view her as a unifying candidate. I'm probably a little bit to the right of where she is, and I think that a lot of people that are more moderate can accept her because we like how she presents herself, even if on policy she's not 100% there with us. I don't think that's true, though, for Bernie supporters, which I think is an interesting dynamic because they have very similar policy positions, and in an incredible way, I think, having worked on the Hillary campaign, feel like she's a good foil to Bernie for all those claims that it wasn't about sexism or gender in 2016. Well, then what's the explanation for the total unwillingness to support her among his supporters if she's the nominee? I think we're seeing, numbers that show that's pretty low.
That's something that struck me when I was talking to voters in New Hampshire before the primary. The Sanders voters never even thought about backing her. They were going to be with him. And, I'm sure there are outliers. I wasn't doing scientific polling, but they were just rock solid with Sanders. They liked her, but saw him as a leader and her as a follower. So, Stephanie, let me ask you a media criticism question in advance of our Friday media criticism show, Beat the Press. Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, in a statement he sent out yesterday when he was exiting the race, said that those of us in the media, I won't point fingers at you, are part of the reason that he didn't fare better. I want to read a little bit of it. Many in the media have noted that I entered the race late. He put that word in quotes. As a direct and limiting consequence, I've met many people on the campaign trail who lament how they wished I had entered the race sooner. We cannot keep mistaking media narratives for political outcomes. Political outcomes are entirely up to voters. I encourage you to keep on respecting their power to make their hopes a reality, even when the media confuses its essential responsibility to report what happens with its extraordinary power to influence what will. Going to give you a chance to respond to that in a second, but first I got to show the Herald cover from today, which had Bernie Sanders sitting on top of a donkey. I think we have it here. Bernie Sanders sitting on a donkey, and the headline essentially said, "Pay no attention to Bernie Sanders win in New Hampshire. It doesn't really count." Are we too quick in the media to impose our narratives on the results rather than just conveying the results themselves?
Adam, I think that's a great question. And an interesting phenomenon we've seen in this primary is kind of voters, instead of just acting like voters and making decisions as voters, they're looking at these candidates sort of in a pundit type way, saying, okay, well, if this person, I think they could do well in this state and that, and who's electable and who's not. And I think that stems from a desire to really just beat Donald Trump. I think Democrats, the number one issue for them is just getting him the heck out of office, and that's what voters care about. But when it comes to Deval Patrick, the tricky thing is that he never really broke out of 1 to 2, maybe 3% in polling. So how much coverage was the press going to give him in the first place if he wasn't really cracking even 5% when we had this tier of 4 or 5 frontrunners? But on the other hand, I mean, you've seen Deval Patrick and Michael Bloomberg. They got in basically on the same day, and Bloomberg has just gotten an outsized amount of coverage, but he's also put an outsized amount of money into the media market.
It helps when you have more money than God, right?
Could I throw one thought in there?
Yeah, please.
I think Michael Bennet would have been thrilled to get the coverage that Deval Patrick got. And,
that's a good point.
And almost all of the coverage I saw about Deval Patrick, other than pointing out that he got in late, was extremely positive. I mean, I think other candidates would have been really happy to have their campaign framed as his was, as this sort of optimistic quest and with a lot of flattering look back on his years in Massachusetts.
One of my coworkers here pointed out that he was the beneficiary of, among other things, a great big, very positive piece in the New Yorker by Jeffrey Toobin, saying, you know, sort of, could he be the Democrat who has it all, which... Yeah, Michael Bennet would probably have liked that.
If I could just add something there before we go on. Even though that was absolutely true, his campaign certainly didn't feel that way in the ending days of his campaign right before the primary. On background, you know, to me, they were going after the New York Times, The View, The Daily Show. The New York Times left Governor Patrick off of their voting guide. They left Patrick and Bennet off until they complained and got themselves in. He couldn't get booked on the Sunday shows. So I think he had a little bit more luck with Boston and local media in New Hampshire and here, but when it came to that national media, he really
I had missed that about the New York Times voter guide, and I can see why that would have stung a bit. Joan, you covered Bill Weld back when he was the governor of Massachusetts. He's running what he's pretty much said is a symbolic campaign. He wants to reawaken what he considers to be a slumbering Republican conscience. He got 10% of the vote in New Hampshire. Donald Trump got 85% of the vote. Is Weld accomplishing anything to your eye?
Well, he got basically the same percentage as Elizabeth Warren got on the Democrat side. Which is
when you put it that way,
which is another way to look at it. I think he is accomplishing something. You know, he's out there. He's making the case for not Trump. The Republicans aren't necessarily open to it, but it takes a certain amount of courage to get up and do that. I mean, I don't know if it's Mitt Romney courage, voting to convict, not acquit in impeachment, but. You can only go so far without money and without media attention. And I mean, I think he's, you know, done a noble thing.
I think he actually has a legitimate complaint about being ignored by the media, because I think it is an interesting narrative. It's unique. It's everything they would usually jump at, and it hasn't been a story. It hasn't been discussed. He did get, I think, like 1 delegate in Iowa too, or something, or you know, some percentage of the vote there. And I think it's a story that belongs in the discussion. He is sort of taking this last stand as, like, you know, what some people conceptualize as a real Republican, or what they'd like the Republican Party to be.
Which you would think could be an irresistible narrative to national media. One thing, though, that struck me about Weld, I don't know if you guys have run into this, but he doesn't seem to be fully enthusiastic as he makes his case. He's kind of going through the motions a little bit.
Some of it is his affect, I think.
Yeah.
He has never really taken himself that seriously, and I think that kind of communicates, you know, through the media.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem.
And
If he had a crisper persona, and if he took things on more directly rather than these sort of winding long sentences that you think he might be speaking Latin at any moment, I don't know. That's my view of it.
Stephanie, I'm going to do a very abrupt turn here. Stay with us, viewers, please. I want to ask you about the state of the Kennedy-Markey Senate race.
Sure.
We have a debate coming up next Tuesday that Jim Braude and Marjorie Egan are moderating. What's your sense of where that race is right now? A lot of us, including myself, have kind of forgotten about it.
I think when they hit the debate stage next week, you can certainly expect them to talk about the environment. It's been kind of Senator Markey's marquee piece of his candidacy, starting the Green New Deal, writing the Green New Deal with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But last week, Congressman Kennedy introduced an environmental justice bill.
I'm glad you know that because I have completely not been aware of it.
So I think that might have been some signaling that he'll be able to kind of turn back and say, you know, I'm no slouch on the environment either.
Do you think that Markey, you know how he loves his acronyms. I'm trying to remember what's the NRA?
Not relevant anymore.
Thank you, Stephanie. Is he gonna come up with an acronym for Joe Kennedy? Do you think? Maybe roll it out at the debate.
Oh gosh, don't make me answer that question. I don't know.
Okay, then in that case, don't answer that. But let me ask you, and all three of you, a much more substantive question. One of the criticisms that we've heard of Kennedy's decision to challenge Markey is that it's going to pull energy away from whoever is running for president in 2020, whoever the Democratic nominee is, and that you'll have, Kennedy volunteers working for him, Markey volunteers working for him, as opposed to those people going up to, say, New Hampshire or another swing state. As someone who has been in the fight, do you think that's a real concern?
I think it is, and I think also, they're burning money on this race, like millions and millions of dollars on this primary, and I think the concern is they're so similar, and there's really no call to action, I think, on Kennedy's part. I think it's a little disappointing because I think if you want to make the millennial argument or that it's time for a new generation of leadership, the ideas should reflect that or point out some sort of capacity that's not being filled. And I think, Markey's pretty on the ball on a lot of these issues and very progressive. And I'm not sure what's added here other than a Kennedy saying, I'd like to be in the Senate before Ayanna Pressley or Maura Reilly or Seth Moulton or et cetera. And I think, I understand that, but it doesn't serve people to have that dynamic in any sort of way.
Joan, I think you got the last word here.
Just going to say, you mentioned Ayanna Pressley, and the same thing was said when she ran against Capuano, right? That they were so similar. What did she bring to the table? We now know, she brings something different.
She does, but she was an African-American woman seeking to become the first African-American woman in the congressional delegation. We've had Kennedys before, and we've got plenty of white men, right? Or, okay, you get to break the tie. Is there something new and dynamic that Joe Kennedy brings?
He does come from a new generation, but I think this conversation about diverting resources was pretty abstract until now, but there were folks, Warren allies, who were up in New Hampshire with her the weekend before the primary who were very frustrated that Congressman Kennedy wasn't up there to stunt for her. He had sent volunteers, he organized phone banks, he did calls, but they felt like him as a political figure with his famous last name and with, his young, dynamic personality would have been useful, but instead he was doing his own organizing event in Boston. But, how could he not? At the same time, he's got a competitive race.
All right. Stephanie Murray, Kaivan Shroff, Joan Vennochi, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.